it's Nicole. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we're going to talk about Catasetum orchids coming out of dormancy. In particular, we're going to be looking at this Monnierara Millennium Magic Witchcraft, which is a very popular Catasetum hybrid. This one is actually coming out of dormancy. As you can see, it has a new growth here. And I'm going to talk about its care and what we need to do to set it up for success. So just some history on this orchid. It bloomed for me on October 6th, and the blooms lasted for 3 weeks. So it slowly started going dormant, losing some leaves on the bottom, and I slowly started throttling the water back. So with Catasetum orchids, everything's very slow. They go through a period of very rapid growth, and then they go dormant. And anytime you are watering them or getting them to go into dormancy, everything is very gradual. So I first started by watering every day when it was in active growth. Then when it was in bloom, maybe twice a week, I wanted to make sure that the media was moist. When the leaves started falling down, I started slowing down to every other week. And then eventually I just ceased watering altogether. Now these leaves started falling off one by one. About 2 weeks ago, all of the leaves fell off, and then I noticed this little growth come in. Now, the bulb on this orchid is generally what gets this orchid through the dormancy. However, there's a new growth that's popping in with a new root system that's going to take over for the entire Catasetum orchid. So the roots are very sensitive. So when a new growth comes in, it's generally advised to repot. Now, generally this is done in the spring, but when you're an indoor grower like me, or if you're in a warm climate, they sometimes don't want to go into dormancy. So we're going to go ahead and repot this orchid just to make sure it's set up for success. And we'll take a look at what we're dealing with here. So this orchid busted through the pot to begin with. These orchids are quite vigorous. When they grow, they really take off and they take over the pot. So I just broke this pot just to get to that root system. And these are the roots from that dormant larger bulb. And I have to be very, very careful for that new bulb. The new bulb will have roots that are going to take over for the rest of this orchid, and they're going to get it through for the next growing season. So what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to get rid of all of these roots in this orchid, because generally from season to season, they may not always last. So I'm going to go ahead and cut off the old roots from this older bulb that's going dormant. And I'm going to make sure to avoid the new roots on the new growth. Now, I wish I noticed the new growth a little bit sooner, because the longer you wait, the more likely it'll be that you'll damage the new roots. So I'm going to tread very carefully here. I'm going to go ahead and cut off these roots. And I usually, when I'm repotting, I water and wet the medium down. But with new Catasetum roots, they're very sensitive to getting watered. So as I said in the beginning, everything with Catasetum orchids is very gradual. So the dormancy is gradual. You start tapering water off very slowly. And when you start introducing water, that's also done very slowly. So as I'm repotting this, I'm keeping in mind that this orchid is still not ready for water. That bulb just went dormant, and that new growth can't get any water itself. Now, as I'm cutting these roots off, yes, there's some roots that are alive and viable. A lot of them are dead, but a lot of them are still alive. But generally, they don't make it from one growing season to the next. So I'm just going to go ahead and cut them off. And then we'll be left with the new growth, which will have a whole new root system that will take over for the entire orchid. So this is what we're left with. I tried my best to avoid the new roots. I inevitably snapped one or two here, unfortunately, but I'm confident that the newer roots will continue to go down into the medium that I'm putting it in. I was very careful with this area in general, so I left some of those roots on there. And given that the sphagnum moss is very dry, it's very difficult to get rid of some of that medium. I'm going to avoid wetting this just because those roots are very susceptible to rot, and I want to be very careful with it. So now that the older bulb doesn't have any roots, it still has a ton of energy stored in that bulb. And the new bulb will take energy from that old bulb that has water reserves and it'll start growing roots. And then once those roots start growing, once they're about 4 to 6 inches long, then we can gradually start introducing water to this orchid. So I just cleared out my space. I got rid of the old moss, and this is what we're left with. As I said, I did snap one of the new roots, so I left a little bit of the medium on. And I think this is a lesson for me in the future that if I see a new growth, just repot it sooner because then I'm less likely to snap roots if they aren't there yet or if they aren't longer yet. If I wait longer, this is going to be a problem. And that pot was already full of roots, so I don't think I could have left it there another grow season without issues. So in terms of repotting this, I'm going to put this back into sphagnum moss in a slightly larger pot. I think the setup worked really well last year, so I'm going to continue with that sphagnum moss grow method. And it also helps keep moisture evenly for that new growth when it starts needing that water more. I want to make sure this orchid is set up for success. So I have my materials here. I've got this 5-inch clear pot with some drainage slats on the side. And this is just slightly larger than the 4-inch square pot that it came in. I've also got sphagnum moss. So sphagnum moss is really hard to work with when it's dry. So I rehydrated it, then I squeezed it out as hard as I could to get out any excess moisture. So it is going to be slightly damp. I tried to dry it out as much as possible to make it workable. But what we're going to do here is we're going to repot it and make sure that this orchid is in front of a moving air source so that it dries as quickly as possible. Though this is quite dehydrated itself, so I squeezed it very, very tightly. So we're going to start by layering some moss at the bottom of the pot. And I like the bottom of this pot because it has a little bit of a little bit of a cone for more aeration. Something that I'm going to do as well is I'm going to leverage some slow release fertilizer for this orchid. Catasetums are very heavy feeders when they're in active growth, so I'm going to follow the instructions on this slow release fertilizer. This one I'm using is the Repot Me brand. So I'm going to add half a teaspoon of slow release fertilizer to this, which is adequate for 4-inch pots, and I think that's fine. And this just ensures that this orchid gets the nutrients that it needs when it's in active growth. In terms of how I'm going to be watering this orchid, I am going to be watering with fertilizer water as well. This orchid can handle it. It likes to be fed more. The growth period is relatively short and fast, so it's going to appreciate the extra nutrients. And in terms of my watering in the summer, it is 300 ppm, so it's going to get about 300 ppm regular watering, and then it's going to get that full dose of that slow release fertilizer. I'm going to add the moss around the bulb, and I do have a stick to stabilize this orchid. So some folks like to keep some of the roots in the pot just to act as a stabilizing agent for the orchid. Given that we don't have that, we don't have an anchor for this orchid, I'm filling around with moss. It's staying relatively fluffy, but I have a support stake that I'm going to tie around the main bulb. And then when that new growth grows in, then those roots are going to be anchoring itself, and then I can remove that support stake, and then I'll remove the tie, and then it could stand up on its own. Now I'm hoping that next year, with all of this good nutrition and good culture that I'm going to give it, the hope is that this new bulb that's going to be growing is going to be larger than last year. I have a feeling it will be a larger growth than 2020's bulb. And the larger the growths and the more bulbs you have for the Catasetum orchids, the more potential they have in giving you more flowers and giving you a really nice show when it comes time to blooming. So we're pretty much set with this Catasetum orchid. I feel like this orchid confuses some folks just because it has a very distinct growth pattern. It goes dormant. The roots basically replace themselves in the new growing season. There's a bulb that nutrients and water is stored, and the new growth really needs to be away from water in this vulnerable time. So this moss is all set. I'm going to put this catasetum that's just been repotted in front of a fan to make sure that that moss is fully dry by tomorrow. And I don't think it'll have detrimental effects to the tender little roots, but I'm not going to be rewatering until that new growth has roots that are between 4 and 6 inches long. This is the whole thing about going very slow with these orchids. You have to do everything very gradually. That growth, you give it water now, it's going to rot, and we don't want to do that. So we have to just be very, very careful with it. So this orchid's going to go back to my shelves until it's ready to go, and then I'll give it water. It'll probably take another month or so. Thank you guys for watching. I know catasetum care can be a little bit confusing, but if you like this video and want to follow along on the updates for this orchid, subscribe to my channel for more regular updates on this and all of my other orchids. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll catch you guys soon. Bye, everyone.